In this video, we're going to continue discussing the theory of evolution as proposed by Charles Darwin. We'll take a look at his main ideas from his book on the origins of species, and later on we'll take a look at the evidence that he used to come up with those ideas. So again, this is a book that Darwin created or wrote. As we discussed in the previous presentation, he didn't want to publish it right away because he was afraid of what the church might think. He was afraid of what other scientists might think, but later on he realized there was a separate scientist, Alfred Wallace, who came up with the similar ideas independently, and so he really wanted to finish the book and get it out there so he can show that he came up with those ideas as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to discuss the main ideas from this book. There's two main ideas. Once you understand these ideas, you'll actually be able to read the book and understand a good chunk of it yourself. So it's a really good read and I highly recommend it. So Darwin had two main ideas that he proposed for his theory of evolution, and that's what we go with today. The first is descent with modification, and the second is natural selection. So if you will recall the three broad observations of life, where life matches its environment, there's a unity to life, so things are very similar to each other, and there's also a great diversity to life. So even though things are similar, there's some diversity in terms of those similar things. We saw the species of beetles, 350,000 different species of beetles that looked very similar, 6 legs, wings, hard shell, but there were also many differences based on their environment. So descent with modification, we'll focus on that first. That helps to explain the unity of life and a little bit about the diversity of life as well. Now that diversity can further be explained by natural selection. That diversity is a result of natural selection, which brings about a match between organisms and their environment. So we're going to take a look at these two ideas in more detail throughout this PowerPoint. What does descent with modification mean? And then what does natural selection mean? And how does it work? And how does it all fit in with those three broad observations of life? So descent with modification is the idea that all organisms that exist today are related to a common ancestor. So you, me, these hairs over here, we're all related by a common ancestor. And that's why we're all so similar to each other. That explains the unity. There's so many similarities because all organisms stem from a common ancestor. Now, if we take a look at this hair over here, this hair lives in the desert. This snowshoe hair over here lives in a colder region where there's snow. And you can see, even though they look similar, there are some clear differences between them. So their similarities their unity can be explained by the fact that they share a common ancestor, but their differences can be explained by the fact that they live in different environments. So for example, at one point in time, you might have had a variety of hares living in the desert. You might have had some that maybe were white and had smaller ears, but they didn't survive because they did not camouflage very well in the desert, and also their small ears did not allow them to get rid of heat. In the desert, it would be really hot. These hares over here had large ears. They were able to get rid of that heat through the large surface area, and as a result, they could survive, pass on their genes. And so that's why today we see these ones in the desert, and these ones over here, well, we see them in colder areas where there might be snow and they can camouflage better. So there might have been a point in time where there were some brown snowshoe hares with big ears in this colder environment, but they died off, could not survive, could not reproduce, and only the ones that could survive, these white ones here with small ears, could reproduce and pass on their genes. So the main idea behind descent with modification is that we're all related by a common ancestor. That explains the unity of life. And over time, changes happen to the common ancestor, not to the individual, but as kids are born, there might be mutations in their DNA, and that leads to variety, that leads to diversity. So the common ancestor may have given rise to, so let's say this is our common ancestor here, it might have given rise to some minor differences in the hairs. So there might have been a brown hair over here and a white hair over here. And then there might have been more diversity that was created throughout as other hairs were born. There might have been some with big ears and small ears, and so they're all these hairs here are related by related to this common ancestor. That again explains the similarities, and differences arose throughout the generations through, Darwin didn't know this, but mutations in DNA. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about, well, why is it that these brown hairs only exist in some areas and these white hairs only exist in other areas? Why do they exist in different environments? And I've already explained that through that process of these ones are just better for their environment and these ones are better for the environment with the snow, but we're going to go and see that in more detail. That's natural selection. Before we see natural selection, though, I want to talk about descent with modification in a bit more detail. I want to talk about these trees over here. These trees are called phylogenetic trees. They're also called cladograms. They show the relationship between the various organisms that have existed in the past and that maybe exist today as well. Not all the organisms on here continue to exist. Many are extinct, but there are some that exist today. So if you take a look over here, you can see the years. Those that still exist at 0 years, they exist today, 0 years ago. And then some might have existed 24 million years ago, 34 million years ago, or somewhere in between that. And so the way this works is, let's say we're looking at these two organisms here. So these two elephants over here. The long name you see here is the scientific name for the organism. These two organisms are related by a common ancestor that's located over here. So that little node there, we call that a common ancestor. We don't know what it is. It was just they're related at some point on that area there. If we look over here, let's say we want to include this organism over here, the one from Asia. It's also related to these two, but its common ancestor with those two would be over here at this node. And the idea is that the closer, the more recent your common ancestor in time, the more closely related you are, the more similar you are in terms of certain characteristics, maybe your DNA. If you were to study it, you'd see that there's a closer relationship there. But if you look back, you can see that all these organisms are actually related to each other by a common ancestor that was found over here. And this tree is even bigger. If we want to connect more organisms, we could just connect this tree to another set of organisms somewhere else. But the idea is that they're all related by common ancestors, and that's the idea of descent with modification, which explains why things are so similar to each other. When Darwin found those fossils of giant versions of present-day species, he noticed they were very similar to each other, and that's because they were related to a common ancestor. And differences arose because of mutations, and then those that were best fit for an environment stayed there, those that weren't, they died off. And that will explain natural selection shortly. So I do want you to be able to explain descent with modification and to be able to see where organisms are closely related to each other. I want you to be able to identify common ancestors. So if I were to ask you to find the common ancestor of, let's say, all these elephants here, I'd want you to go back in time, be able to spot that that common ancestor is, if we trace it back from here, would be right over here for the common ancestor of all those elephants. If you want to include this elephant in here as well, then you'd have to circle this one. If you want to include this one over here, then you'd have to circle this one. So they're all very, and if you want all the organisms, you'd have to circle this one over here. So each tip of the tree over here represents a specific organism, and then each little node over here represents a common ancestor for those organisms. So that brings us to an important point to consider. A lot of people think that when we study evolution, we are saying that monkeys or chimps or whatever you use evolved into humans or transformed into humans, and that's not the case at all. If we look at this cladogram, or again another word for it is phylogenetic tree, if you look at this tree here, you'll notice that yes, humans and chimps are related to each other. So this would be the our species of humans, the Homo sapiens, and this would be the chimp over here. You'll notice that we are related by a common ancestor, which explains similarities between us in terms of our DNA, in terms of physical characteristics and features. So we are related by this common ancestor over here. There have been other organisms that we've been closely related to, but they don't exist anymore. They've been wiped out. So you can see, for example, the Neanderthals over here. We are very closely related to them. They're one of our closest relatives. but they're no longer living, so we don't consider them anymore, but we would still draw them in our phylogenetic tree or cladogram. This phylogenetic tree does not have a time axis, so that's why we don't see them a little bit before us. We don't see where they ended. It just tries to focus on the relationship between organisms and how closely related they are. So the reason reason I know that we're more closely related to the Neanderthals over here is because we have a common ancestor that's closer in time over here than we would with our chimp. So there's no clear timeline on this, but the point I want to make here in this cladogram is that you can still infer time. The lower down you are, so as we go down this way, that's farther back in time, or you can say down this way, that's farther back in time. So we share a common ancestor with the chimps over here. We share a common ancestor with, let's say, this organism at node B. We share a common ancestor with these two organisms at node C. These two organisms here, they're very closely related to each other. They share a common ancestor over here at node D. And then if we want to include Homo erectus in our group of humans here, we share a common ancestor with Homo erectus and the Neanderthals at node E over here. So again, chimps did not transform into us. We just share a common ancestor with them, which explains all the great deal of similarities that exist between chimps and humans. And so you can see the imaginary time axis that you would have on a phylogenetic tree. As you go up, we get closer to the present day age. Not all of these species would continue to exist. If you added another timeline to actually reflect time and when they stop existing, you could illustrate that as we saw in the previous slide. But here, for example, if we were comparing species A, B, and C, they all share a common ancestor at this point over here. Species A and B are more closely related to each other than they are to species C because they share a common ancestor over here. So they have a more recent common ancestor. So they are more closely related to each other. Don't look at the distance between species B and C. What you should look at is where they share a common ancestor. So if it's higher up that they share that common ancestor together, that means they're more closely related to each other than, let's say, species C and A, because their common ancestor is a little bit lower down, back in time. Sometimes what you might see on a phylogenetic tree are characteristics and when those characteristics appeared in organisms. So those characteristics are often represented by these little bars over here with the names written next to it. Here we can see branching points, again, where common ancestors have split into different groups of organisms. So you can see, for example, common ancestor 1 split into lungfishes and then some other group somewhere over here. And the reason we can figure out where the split happened is because all of a sudden there were some characteristics that appeared, and we can use the appearance of characteristics in order to determine where certain groups split off. So you can see, for example, that we have tetrapod limbs, so having 4 legs that developed at this point over here. So any organism sort of beyond node 2 over here, beyond ancestor 2, would have the tetrapod limbs, would have those 4 legs. The amnion, the amniotic sac, where the organism develops, that developed at this point over here. So the amnion would be included in things like mammals, lizards, snakes, crocodiles, ostriches, hawks, and other birds. However, it would not be included in the amphibians because it developed after node 2, where the amphibians were created. It would not be included in the lungfishes either. Tetrapod limbs would be included in the amphibians and everything else, except for the lungfishes, because it developed at this point here after the node for when lungfishes were created. So, for example, if I asked you about feathers, where would you find those? Well, you should be able to find the characteristic of feathers and realize that anything after feathers would have it. So ostriches, hawks, and other birds, but you wouldn't see it in crocodiles, lizards, and snakes, and mammals, and amphibians because it developed later. So these characteristics that we use to build these phylogenetic trees and these cladograms, we call them homologous characteristics. They basically mean characteristics that develop in an ancestor so that we can use it to figure out how closely related organisms are. So if we see a bunch of organisms have the amnion, chances are they're more closely related to each other than with organisms that don't have the amnion. So if we look at common ancestor 3, anything above that have the amnion, so they're more closely related to each other than they would be to the amphibians. So for example, hawks and other birds are more closely related to mammals than they are to amphibians because of that amnion, which, in other words, you could also say because they have a more recent common ancestor. The common ancestor of amphibians and hawks and birds, they're at number 2. That's farther back in time. So this is like the cladogram on the previous page, just rotated a bit. Farther back in time would be going this way to the left of the screen, and closer to present time would be to the right of the screen. So this is closer to present time, to the right of the screen. And again, you should be able to read a cladogram and phylogenetic tree in a similar way to the way I described in the examples provided. So if I were to ask you who's more closely related to each other, ostrich, who's more closely related to the ostrich, the hawks and the birds, or the crocodiles, you should be able to explain that it's the hawks and the birds because they share a more recent common ancestor at 6, whereas for the crocodiles they share it at 5. If I were to ask you who is the crocodile more closely related to, the ostrich or the hawks and birds? Well, a lot of students would say the ostrich, because the ostrich is physically closer on this tree than the hawks and birds. But you know what? It doesn't really matter. That's not the point that matters. I could have actually put hawks and birds here and ostriches here. The tree would mean the same thing. You never look at the distance between the pictures or the names. What you look at is where they share a common ancestor. So for crocodiles, they share a common ancestor with ostriches, hawks, and birds at 0.5. They share it, the ostrich, hawks, and birds share a common ancestor at the same point with the crocodiles, which is at 0.5 over here. So what that means is that the crocodiles, they're equally related to the ostrich and the hawks and birds because they share a common ancestor at the same area. However, the ostriches, hawks, and birds are more closely related to each other than they are to the crocodiles because they share a common ancestor over here. So those are things I want you to start thinking about as we talk about these phylogenetic trees, these cladograms. We'll see them in more detail. We'll learn how to build them, but I want you to start planting that seed because you will have a question about this on a quiz, assessment, or interview that we do. So that was common descent. What we'll do now is we'll talk about, descent with modification. So again, we talked about the idea that all organisms, they look similar to each other because they're all related by a common ancestor somewhere along the line. And over time, there's modifications that occur because of mutations. Again, Darwin didn't really know about those mutations in too much depth, but we know that the differences happen because of mutations. So now what we're going to do is we're going to try to explain the broad observation of life, which is that organisms seem to match their environment. So what was interesting about Darwin, or what was unique about him, or not really unique, but what really got us is that he proposed a mechanism for evolution. He didn't just say things change, done. He actually explained how it happened. Lamarck was pretty close too. He believed in evolution. He said things change. He gave an explanation, which was his use and disuse and acquired characteristics, but it was just the incorrect mechanism. So Darwin proposed a more correct mechanism, which is natural selection. And so in his mechanism of natural selection, there's actually 4 observations. And then from those observations, there are some inferences. So you need to know the observations and you need to know the inferences. And we're going to take a look at each of these observations and inferences and relate it to the peppered moth example that we saw previously in the first presentation. So his observations is that in a population, there is going to be variation. You're going to have a lot of variety, so you might have black and white color, for example. So there's variation that exists. The second one is that, the second observation Darwin noticed is that those traits, they can be passed on from parent to offspring, so they're heritable traits. The third observation that Darwin made is that all species will make offspring, and they'll actually make more offspring than the environment can support. They'll just make babies like crazy. They won't think. If you are a human and you're planning on having a family, you'll think about it now and maybe say, I don't have the resources necessary to raise a family right now. I might wait off. But overall, as a species, as a population, we are reproducing like crazy. And rabbits, they won't think, okay, our income's not high enough right now. Let's not have babies. They'll just keep reproducing like crazy. So Darwin noticed that organisms just reproduce. It doesn't really matter what resources are available. They just reproduce like crazy. The other observation Darwin made is that eventually, because there's not enough resources, some of the offspring won't survive. So those were observations he made. He noticed populations mate and things died. So here are the inferences. He said, of the individuals that survived, the reason they survived is because they just had better traits for that environment. So individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment tend to leave off more offspring than other individuals. So if you have an individual that has a good trait for that environment, it will survive, it will most likely reproduce, and will pass on its characteristics. And so what he was saying is that because only those individuals with favorable traits survive, that leads to a situation where when you enter that environment, you're going to see organisms that just seem to match it, right? So the reason you'll see the hare that's brown with big ears in the desert is because it survived, passed on its genes. And the reason you don't see the white one with little ears is because it died and didn't pass on its genes. So those are the main observations and inferences that explain what natural selection is. You might have heard the term survival of the fittest. It's a bit misleading. It's not something that really Darwin proposed, but someone kind of used that to explain his theory of evolution by natural selection. Basically, the ones that are better fit for the environment survive in that environment. And it's all about that environment. The environment can change. I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this. So let's go through those observations and inferences using the peppered moth example. So one of the observations Darwin made was that populations have variety. That variety has to exist. Natural selection, I want to get this out of the way right now, does not create variety. That variety has to exist in the population to begin with for natural selection to act. You need to have variety and variation. So there's differences in characteristics. We have the dark moths and the white moths. So that's our observation number one. Those are due to genetic differences. And we know that because we saw the genetics unit. So there might have been recessive alleles, dominance allele, codominance, whatever be the case, there's variety there. So one of the main source of variety, all original variety comes from mutations. So random changes in DNA over time. So you read about mutations. The variety does not come from use and disuse. So Lamarck said that, some giraffes have long necks, some have short necks because some use it more than others. That's not what it is. It's all from mutations, change in the DNA sequence. So it might have been that at one point in time, all of the moths were black, and then in the gametes there was a mutation, and just some of them ended up being white because there was a recessive allele that resulted from that mutation. So mutations, they are the original source of all variation that exists. And then after that, you can have more variation because of those things we saw, for example, crossing over and independent assortment and all that stuff there. But the original source of all variation comes from mutations. That's super important to understand. So even though we sometimes say mutation is a bad thing because it can lead to things like cancer, mutation can also be a good thing because it leads to all the variety on Earth, and as a result to the survival of species, because some will survive at least, as opposed to all being the same and all dying. So again, similar to the previous presentation, what you should do is read the suggested readings and answer the questions provided on the slide or in your worksheets so that you can understand some of these concepts in a bit more depth and detail, especially if the PowerPoint didn't help you understand them in as much detail as you would have liked. So the next point, the second observation, is that these traits are passed on from parent to offspring. So the idea is that for natural selection to actually work, you need to have heritable variation. If variation can't be passed on, then those characteristics that allowed you to survive in the first place, they're not going to help the next generation since they're not passed on to your kids. So the idea is that if we're looking at the peppered moth example, color is a heritable trait. It's in the genes. So if you have two black moths, they can give birth to another black moth, or if they carried a recessive allele, they could give birth to a white moth. So the idea is that there has to be heritable variation there. So for natural selection to work, you need variation, but you also need that variation to be heritable as well. The third observation is that there's a struggle for existence, and that's kind of observation 3 and observation 4 at the same time. A struggle for existence. So Darwin had said that organisms reproduce like crazy, and they produce more offspring than their environment can support. So over here we can see that we had a lot of offspring produced. We had some white, and we had some Black moths, more white than black at this point, but there were a lot of offspring produced. Now, the fourth observation, again, still tying into struggle for existence, is that because we have a lot of offspring, not all of them will be able to survive. And it just so happens that the ones that will survive are the ones that have the better traits for that environment. So in this case here, we can see this is the example of the Industrial Revolution, where we had the ash build up on the tree. The tree is now very dark. The black ones were able to camouflage more effectively than the white ones. So the birds could see the white ones, and the birds just ate off more of the white ones. The black ones survived, and the white ones would eventually die off, and the black ones could pass on their characteristics, and they would make up a bigger proportion of the population. So now on those black trees, it just so happens that the moths that are black better fit that environment, and that the reason they better fit that environment, or the reason you see them in that environment, is because they're the ones that were able to survive and reproduce. So all these white ones here, they were just killed off by the predator, and the black ones survived, and then they were able to reproduce and pass on their genes. And so that explains why these organisms best match their environment. So what Darwin was saying is that there's a struggle for survival, a struggle for existence. And the organisms that survive and that pass on their genes are the ones that just have a better characteristic for that particular environment. If the trees had stayed white, then you would have seen a larger proportion of white moths in this population, because they would have had the better characteristic. So this black pigmentation, or this black color of the moth, is now called an adaptation. It's a characteristic that allowed for the organism to better survive in that environment. So not all characteristics are adaptations, but if it was a characteristic that did allow for survival and for passing on of the genes more effectively than another, we now call that an adaptation to this environment. And it's not something that the organism did to itself necessarily. It's something that already existed, but with the new environment it became an adaptation because it just gave it an edge in that environment. So what we've seen here is something called differential reproductive success. That's probably the most important idea of natural selection. Yes, survival is important, but to actually see a change in gene frequencies, to actually see more of these black moths, they not only had to survive, they also had to reproduce. So we've witnessed differential reproductive success. The white ones, they did not have success in reproducing, so they died off. The black ones, they did have success in reproducing, so they passed on their genes. So when we talk about fit individuals in natural selection, fitness actually refers to not just the ability to survive, but the ability to reproduce and pass on genes. If you survive and don't pass on your genes, your fitness, if you don't do this, your fitness is actually zero. On an evolutionary level, doesn't matter how strong you are, your fitness has become zero because you could not pass on your genes. So what we've seen here is our inferences 1 and 2. These had characteristics that gave them a higher probability of survival. As a result, they were able to pass on their genes and live in that environment. The white ones could not. The white ones are gone. The black ones are still here. So that's inferences 1 and 2. You should be able to explain the evolution of a population using this process of natural selection, using the 4 observations and 2 inferences that we have seen. You should be able to explain what fitness means at an evolutionary level, meaning it's not just the ability to survive, but it's also the ability to reproduce and pass on your genes. And then, hopefully your offspring can also continue doing that, so it goes beyond that. And you should be able to define what an adaptation is and provide an example of an adaptation. In an environment where the tree was white, and the white ones survived, but the black ones died off, then the white coloration would have been the adaptation, because the white ones would have had the reproductive success and the black ones would not have had that. When we say differential reproductive success, differential means that, well, some organisms have reproductive success and others don't in that environment. Those that do survive pass on their genes. Those that don't, they don't survive, they die, and they're no longer in that environment. So what I would like you to do is to go in your textbook and find this figure here, figure 3, and I want you to explain why these organisms would have these different characteristics. How did these features Why are they adaptations in their environment? For example, why is the polar bear having, let's say, white fur and thick insulation an adaptation in its particular environment? Why would this anteater, why would this be an adaptation in its environment? Why would a feature like this be an adaptation in the environment? Why would a feature like this be an adaptation in the environment? So think about how these features may have enhanced or increased fitness of these individuals to allow them to survive and reproduce and pass on their genes. So here we can see a summary of the process of natural selection. So again, there's a struggle for existence. You can see in this cricket population, there's some yellow crickets and some green crickets, and they produce a lot of kids. And the idea is that in this population there's variation, and that variation is going to be heritable. So some of them will pass on green, some of them will pass on yellow, but there's some heritable variation in the population as well. And again, that struggle for existence, because there's so many kids, not all of them can survive. Some of them will have to die off. And so we can see that there's a predator over here eating the crickets. And as you can see in the picture and probably guessed, some of the crickets have characteristics that allow them to hide more effectively. The green ones can hide more effectively in the green grass. And the yellow crickets, well, they can't hide effectively. And so they're going to die off. And there's going to be a differential reproductive success scenario happening here. The green ones are going to survive, reproduce, pass on their genes. The yellow ones, well, they won't survive as easily. They won't really be able to pass on their genes because they're not surviving. And so there'll be fewer yellow ones in the next generations, but more green ones in the next generations. And that's the idea of natural selection, differential reproductive success. So the green ones survive, passed on their genes. The yellow ones, they're dying off in the population and they cannot pass on their genes. And so again, this is a different scenario, but the same explanation for that. So this is a summary of the process of evolution, the concept of evolution by natural selection. So evolution itself, what we saw as microevolution. It's a change in the genetic composition of the population. So for example, there were a lot of white moths, and now a few generations later there's fewer white moths, more black moths. And so that's a change in the composition of the population over time. So that is what evolution is. But evolution happens by a process, by a mechanism. The process that Darwin described, the correct process, is natural selection. So in natural selection, certain traits are selected for in the environment and against in the environment. So I'll give you some more examples of that in just a bit, but the idea I want you to get is that evolution is the actual change itself. Natural selection is a process or the mechanism that led to that change. So like I said, there's two types of evolution. The one that we're studying right now is microevolution, which is the change in allele frequencies over time. And it can happen over shorter periods of time. It can happen from one generation to another. So here we have some insects, let's just say. 80% of the insects have green genes and 20% in the population is brown genes, coloration. And let's just say that the green ones were able to hide more effectively in their environment. Well, if that were in this case, sorry, the brown ones are able to hide more effectively. For some reason, the grass becomes brown, there was a drought, and the brown ones can now survive more effectively in the environment. Well, what would happen is the brown ones, they'd pass on their genes, and you can see there's a higher proportion of brown ones now compared to the green ones, and that's just in one generation. The green ones have decreased a bit. They went from 80 to 60, and the brown ones have increased a bit. So I'm explaining that by saying that the grass probably turned brown, and they were able to camouflage themselves more effectively. And so this change in gene frequencies, that's evolution. And the idea that the brown ones are able to survive and reproduce and pass on their genes, that's the natural selection process that led to the evolution, to that microevolution. Another type of evolution that we're going to see later on is called macroevolution. And macroevolution is evolution on a larger scale, macro meaning big. And so that's evolution, that's basically many generations of microevolution, many generations and changes that occur, and that leads to larger transformations. So things like new species and new groups of species called taxa, we'll see that later on, new groups of organisms that form. So all the different species that exist today are a result of this macroevolution, or the majority, I should say. And so we'll see that in more detail in the second half of the evolution unit. Again, you should read the suggested questions and read the suggested textbook pages and answer the questions provided to get a greater detailed understanding of the concepts that we saw in this presentation so far. And what we're going to do is we're going to summarize the idea of natural selection and evolution with a little bit of an animation and scenario. So again, natural selection is a process that leads to the evolutionary change that we discussed. What I need you to get, again, is that natural selection is not creating the differences in the environment. The differences, the variation, they already exist as a result of mutations, just random mutations that created this variation. So natural selection did not create brown bugs to survive in the environment. There was a mutation, it led to brown bugs, and just so happened that the birds can't see the brown bugs, but they see the green ones, and they're killing those ones off. So natural selection is about just having the right trait at the right time for that environment and surviving and passing on your genes. So what happens over time because of natural selection is that over time, natural selection can increase the match between organisms and their environment. Meaning it's just because of being lucky enough to have the right characteristic, you're going to survive in that environment, and you're just going to see more organisms that seem to be better fit for that environment, just because the other ones were already killed off. You didn't see that, but the other ones were already killed off. And so again, natural selection leads to that evolutionary change. So here we can see a summary of the observations and the inferences that Darwin made, which led to the theory of evolution by natural selection. So Darwin said, yes, changes happen in populations and organisms over time, and that's because of natural selection. So just to discuss those terms in a little bit more detail, remember that natural selection and evolution is about the idea of differential reproductive success. Some organisms will survive and reproduce and pass on their genes. Others won't survive. As a result, they won't reproduce and they won't pass on their genes. What I want you to get in this as well is that individuals are not evolving. It's the population that evolves. So you can see here we have a population of giraffes, and at one point in time there was variation that already existed. So some had long necks and some had short necks, let's just say. Okay. Now in this fictitious environment, there's these little missiles that just fly around the sky. They fly around the sky. And so I want you to predict these missiles are flying around the sky using Darwin's framework for natural selection, his observations and inferences. Predict what the population of these giraffes may look like over a generation or a few generations. Try to use words like which one would have higher fitness in this environment, which one would experience that reproductive success and which ones would not experience reproductive success. Overall, I want you to get the population has changed, not the individual giraffe. So the giraffes did not transform the neck size. That variation already existed to begin with. So as you can see, the missile hit the giraffe with the longer neck. It's not surviving, and therefore it's probably not reproducing very much, and it's not passing on its genes. The ones that had shorter necks, they were able to survive. And so they could probably reproduce more and pass on their genes, and so you'd say they're more fit than the ones with the longer necks. So what I need you to understand as well is that a characteristic or an adaptation may be good in one environment but bad in another. So for example, long necks in the giraffes today that we know, that's a good characteristic to have, to reach the food on the tall trees, to maybe attract a mate. But in this environment with the missiles, long necks, they're not an advantage. They're actually a disadvantage. So natural selection really depends on the environment. There's no perfect trait for every environment. It just depends on what the environment is at that moment. So as you can see, long necks are not good in this environment, but short necks are. The other important thing to understand is that it's the environment that selects for characteristics. So the environment is doing the selection. When we say natural selection, in a way the environment is the deciding factor for what the good characteristic is. So this missile is selecting against the big neck, the long neck, but it's selecting for the short neck. It's rooting for the short neck. Not really, but in a way that's kind of how the environment operates. So we call that a selective pressure. It's an environmental condition that will either choose a trait to be the advantage and choose a trait to be the disadvantage. It's not actively doing that with a brain, but that's just the idea behind it. So selective pressures determine fitness. Remember that fitness is not about being the biggest and strongest all the time. Fitness is about being able to survive, true, but it's also about being able to reproduce and pass on your genes. So I need you to understand what fitness means on an evolutionary level. So fitness is really, the emphasis is about can you reproduce and pass on your genes. So we can take a look at this example here with the sneaky fish. There's two fish here, and they both want to reproduce and pass on their genes. Now, you might look at this one and say the bigger one's going to be, the top dog. It will be able to it will be able to impregnate this fish because it's bigger and stronger than the small fish over here. Now, this is a great example of fitness not being about the biggest all the time. This fish is actually a sneaky fish. It can go and fertilize eggs because it's so small, sneak in when there's a lot of fish around and just fertilize those eggs. And so it's going to pass on its genes, and you're going to have more small fish in the population. So actually being smaller in this case made this fish the fitter fish because it's able to reproduce and pass on its genes to the next generation, whereas this one was not able to do that. It was not able to pass on its genes. So sometimes being the sneakiest, in this case, made it the fittest. So fitness focuses on that reproduction and passing on of genes, not just about being the biggest and the strongest. A great example of that is a mule. So a mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey. Here we have the mule. So these are two different species that have mated, and they produced something called a mule. Now the mule is very, very, very strong. It's a very tough organism, but in terms of passing on its genes, it actually has zero fitness. Mules are sterile. They are made from the breeding of two different species, and oftentimes that results in sterile organisms, meaning they can't make babies. And so because mules are sterile, even though they're very strong, they can carry a lot of weight for you, and they might be useful in society for certain features, the mule has zero fitness on an evolutionary level. It's never going to pass on its genes, and it won't increase in terms of population unless we humans go and create them ourselves. But they won't continue to increase in their population because as soon as one's made, it won't pass on its genes and it's done. So it's not always about survival of the fittest. I need you to get that it's more about survival of the fittest for its environment and also reproduction of the fittest and passing on the genes from the fittest individuals. That's what really matters when it comes to natural selection and evolution being able to actually occur. So like I said, natural selection will only act on traits that are there but also heritable. If this giraffe, if short necks were not heritable, then natural selection can't really act on it or amplify it or diminish it. If you couldn't pass on the short neck gene, well then you'd only have these short neck giraffes here, but they wouldn't pass on short necks to the next generation because it just so happens that it's not a heritable feature. So natural selection can only act on features that are heritable and that can be passed on in the next generation. If you get big muscles and you survive because you have big muscles, well, you're not going to pass on those big muscles to the kids in the next generation, so you're not necessarily going to see more individuals with big muscles in the next generation, unless there was something genetic. And again, the idea is that natural selection can only act on existing variation. It does not create new traits. So it can't create individuals that will avoid the missiles. It's just if there are individuals around that were lucky enough to have short necks, they'll survive. which is again explains the importance of random mutations and diversity. If you don't have that biological diversity, well, organisms will just die off. If all the giraffes had long necks, they would all be killed off by these missiles, killing them, and as a result, all the giraffes would be gone today. But luckily, there was some variation in the population. The short necks survived, and we still have giraffes that survived, and they did not go extinct. Here you can see another example of another scenario of evolution and the process of natural selection. So I want you to go through this example and understand what's happening. Try to maybe look at the pictures and explain it yourself before reading it, and then go back and see if your explanation was pretty close to the explanation given in the picture. So I just want to finish off by talking about why Pokemon again is wrong. Pokemon implies evolution is the transformation of individuals. So one Pokemon will transform randomly into another one that's bigger and stronger. Individuals are not transforming. The reason there's different variety, different types of individuals, because mutation in the gametes led to different individuals over time and led to variety in the population. Natural selection will act on the individual, but in reality, evolution happens at the population level. So natural selection selects individuals to survive and to die. It's the environment doing that. But the individual didn't randomly transform. What did change was the number of types of individuals in the population, and that's what evolution was. So the smallest unit on which evolution can act, evolution itself, the change, is on a population level. Natural selection will act on the individuals in the population, but the population is the thing that evolved, not the individual, like Pokemon implies. So here's more what Pokemon should do if it wants to be more accurate. Here we have no mutations, all the individuals are the same. So Eevees have babies, they're all Eevee. Here there's a mutation, some random mutation one day leads to these little Vaporeon things. They're like Eevees, but just some differences in their characteristics. Same idea here, random mutation. Now we have little Flareons, like Eevees, but just maybe more heat tolerant. So now we have variety in our population because of random mutations. One day, if there's a flood, our Eevees won't go extinct, or our population won't go extinct, or our species won't go extinct. We're going to have some individuals survive. These ones here that can swim because of their lucky mutation, they'll survive, reproduce, and pass on their genes. If, on the other hand, we had a fiery environment, this one would evaporate, this one would burn, they'd die off. These ones here would survive, pass on their genes, and reproduce, and you'd have a bunch of little Flareons in the environment. Now that would not be as fun as seeing an individual transform, but that's the reality of evolution. Natural selection acted on the individual. Now the population has evolved, it's different. There are more Flareons in the environment compared to Vaporeons and other little Eevees in the environment. So again, the idea is that natural selection does not create that variation, it was a mutation. If natural selection did create variation, then you'd see, for example, these organisms with little chainsaws for hands so they could chop down their trees. We might have wings, we could grow wings if we wanted to so we could fly to work instead of having to drive to work or walk to work. It might be more efficient. So natural selection just acts on the existing variation, it does not create variation. Now that we've gone through this presentation, you should be able to explain things, different scenarios and different pictures, using natural selection and using the idea of evolution. So for example, if you were to look at this scenario here and I were to tell you that one of these organisms, one of these features is actually very low in frequency in the population, you should be able to pick which phenotype is low in the population, at least in this population. And you should also be able to maybe explain a mechanism as to why that phenotype might be low in the population, using the idea of fitness, reproductive success, and natural selection, using the ideas of, again, differential reproductive success. So I want you to focus on that. Which one would have higher reproductive success, which one would have lower? Which one would be able to survive in the environment, and which one would not be able to survive in that environment? So use the observations and the inferences to explain fitness as well, to explain evolution and fitness, using those observations and inferences. So here we have the readings from the Nelson textbook that you should focus on. I do want you to do the questions that are suggested and also answer these questions here. It's a great thought thought investigation. It will help you to understand the concepts that we saw in the presentation in some more detail.